The first time my mother locked the front door on me, I was still holding the condolence tray someone had dropped off after my grandfather's funeral, like that little aluminum pan could prove I belonged there. The latch clicked. The deadbolt turned. And through the frosted glass I saw her silhouette pause, not with hesitation, but with that satisfied stillness people get when they think they've finally solved a problem. I stood on the porch in my black funeral clothes with a backpack at my feet and my grandfather's voice in my head telling me, very gently, that some families love you like an investment and call it values. I'm Layla Chen. I was 23 at the time, freshly graduated, not employed yet in the way my parents could brag about, and therefore, in their eyes, one bad week away from being a lesson. My parents loved order, appearances, and leverage. They didn't love me less than my brother. They just loved him the way you love something that reflects you back. I was the one who asked questions. I was the one who didn't clap on cue. I was the one Grandpa used to wink at across dinner tables when my dad started one of his speeches about discipline and gratitude. My grandfather had been the only person in that house who didn't treat me like a project. He'd pick me up in his old sedan, take me for noodles, and let me talk about whatever was in my head without turning it into a lecture. When I was little, he'd press a coin into my palm and say, "This isn't money. It's options." I thought it was just Grandpa being Grandpa. After he died, I realized it was a warning. The night they kicked me out, my father didn't even pretend it was temporary. He stood behind my mother, arms folded, and told me, through the door like I was a solicitor, that I needed to learn independence. He said I'd been disrespectful at the funeral because I refused to promise I'd take the corporate trainee path my uncle had arranged. Then he delivered the real line, the one that was meant to sting and stick. He said Grandpa left everything where it belongs, and that I should stop acting like I was special. I remember looking down at my hands and realizing I was still wearing the small silver ring Grandpa had given me when I turned 18, the one with a tiny engraved sparrow on the inside. I turned it once around my finger, because I didn't want to cry on that porch and give them the satisfaction. I picked up my backpack and walked away, not because I had a plan, but because there was nowhere else to stand without begging. I slept that first night in my car in a grocery store parking lot, the kind with bright lights and security cameras. It was humiliating in a boring, quiet way. No dramatic rain. No cinematic music. Just me, trying to figure out how to fold my body into a seat while my phone battery died inch by inch. In the morning, I drove to the small rented storage unit Grandpa had kept for years. It wasn't a secret exactly. Everyone knew it existed. My parents just never cared because Grandpa was eccentric, which was the family code word for "we don't understand him, so we'll mock him." The unit smelled like dust and cedar. There were old books, a few battered suitcases, framed photos I'd never seen, and a metal toolbox that looked too sturdy for the junk around it. I opened the toolbox and found an envelope wedged underneath the tray. It was thick, old, sealed with clear tape. My name was written on it in Grandpa's handwriting, the slightly shaky but careful kind he used when something mattered. Inside was a short note and a card. The note said, in plain words, "Little Sparrow. Not for them. For you. If you are reading this, it means they chose pride over blood. Don't argue. Don't beg. Just go to the bank on Willow and ask for private client services. Show them the card. Then sit down and breathe." The card didn't look like a normal bank card. It was heavier, metal-edged, matte black, with no visible numbers. No chip that I could see. Just a small embossed mark near the corner, like a crest, and my grandfather's initials in tiny lettering on the back. It felt like something that wasn't supposed to end up in an average person's wallet. I sat on the dusty floor of that storage unit and tried to think logically. Maybe it was a safe deposit key. Maybe it was some outdated account with a few $1,000s. Maybe Grandpa had hidden an emergency fund because he'd known my parents would pull this stunt. That was the version of reality my brain could handle. A soft landing. A little help. Enough to rent a room and breathe. I drove straight to the bank on Willow because there was nothing else to do and because the note didn't sound like Grandpa guessing. It sounded like Grandpa finishing a sentence he started years ago. The branch was bright, polite, and empty in that mid-morning lull. I walked up to the counter with my backpack still on, looking like someone who had taken a wrong turn on the way to a job interview. The teller smiled with professional warmth and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to speak to private client services. She glanced at me, then at my backpack, then back at me, and started to give me the kind of smile people give right before they offer you a brochure instead of help. Then I slid the card across the counter. The change in her face happened so fast it was almost funny. Her smile didn't fade gradually. It fell off. Her eyes went wide just enough to be visible, then she looked down like the card might bite her. She didn't pick it up right away. She touched it with 2 fingers, turned it slightly, and her throat moved like she'd swallowed something wrong. "I'm sorry," she said, suddenly careful. "Can I see your ID?" I handed it over. She typed, paused, typed again. Her screen reflected faintly in her glasses, and I saw a long string of characters appear, then a color I didn't recognize in a normal bank system. Her hand started to shake. Not a lot. Just enough that I noticed. Then she stood up without telling me why and walked briskly to a door behind the counter. A minute later, I heard a soft click from somewhere deeper in the branch. Another click. Not loud, but deliberate, like doors I hadn't noticed were being secured. The teller returned with a man in a navy suit who didn't look like he belonged in a neighborhood branch. He looked like someone who normally meets people in offices with soundproof walls and expensive coffee. He didn't introduce himself at first. He just looked at the card, then looked at me, then looked back at the card like he was confirming a ghost. "Ms. Chen," he said finally, voice low and controlled, "would you please come with me?" As I followed him toward the private offices, I caught a glimpse of the teller's screen as she turned it away. For a split second, a balance field flashed in the corner with commas and too many digits, and the number started with 1.2. The manager's hand tightened on the door handle like he needed it to stay upright. Daniel's office felt like a different bank than the one in the lobby, like the branch had a hidden layer meant for people who never stand in lines. The door shut with a soft seal instead of a click, and for a second the quiet made my heartbeat sound loud. He set my ID on the desk, then placed the black metal-edged card beside it with the kind of careful respect you use for something that can cause problems. "Ms. Chen," he said, finally giving me his name, "Daniel Rourke, branch manager. Before we do anything else, I need to verify you, verify the credential, and verify that you're not under coercion." The words were calm, but his posture wasn't casual, and that contrast made my stomach tighten. I told him my grandfather left the card in an envelope with a note. The moment I mentioned the note, his eyes sharpened. He asked to see it, read it once, then again, slower, and when he finished he smoothed the paper flat like he was trying to press the emotion out of it. "This card isn't a normal debit card," he said. "It's a legacy access credential tied to a private banking profile. We almost never see them presented in a retail branch." He pulled a small reader from a drawer, scanned the card, typed in a code, and I watched him watch the screen the way people watch test results. His fingers stopped moving for a beat, and that beat felt longer than it was. Then he exhaled carefully and said, "The profile is active. The assets are real. And the balance is substantial." I forced myself to ask the question that felt impossible to say out loud. "That number I saw," I whispered, "was it real?" Daniel didn't smile, didn't dramatize it, didn't do the movie thing where someone announces wealth with excitement. He just nodded once and said, "Approximately 1.2 billion. My brain rejected it so hard it almost made me dizzy. I heard myself laugh, small and ugly, and say that my grandfather drove an old sedan and lived in a 2-bedroom house, as if lifestyle could disprove a number. Daniel's expression softened in the way people soften when they've seen this shock before. "Privacy looks like simplicity," he said. "And sometimes simplicity is a shield." He turned his monitor slightly so I could see headings without seeing everything, and I caught words that made my throat go tight: Chen Legacy Trust, Beneficiary Review, and then my name. "Layla Chen," I said, pointing like the text might vanish if I blinked. It says I'm the beneficiary. It does, Daniel replied, but being named and being able to access are two different steps. Your grandfather set this up with restrictions. Identity verification, independent counsel confirmation, and a beneficiary acceptance process. It's designed to prevent someone from bullying you into signing something you don't understand or handing over credentials under pressure. Under pressure. The phrase landed with a dull weight, because I had been under pressure my entire life and just never called it that. I told him, bluntly, that my parents kicked me out last night and said Grandpa left everything where it belongs, and Daniel didn't look surprised. He looked like a man watching a predictable storm roll in. Then we should assume there will be interference, he said. And your grandfather assumed it too. There's a protective protocol attached to this trust. If non-beneficiaries attempt to redirect, co-sign, or seize access, the account locks and a compliance report triggers internally. I stared at him. Locks how? In a way that protects you, he said carefully. But it also slows everything down. That's the trade-off. It stops theft, but it can delay distribution until counsel is in place. Before I could ask what that meant for me sleeping in my car, his desk phone rang. Daniel glanced at the caller ID, then at me, and answered with the kind of neutral tone people use when they're handling someone dangerous without letting them know. He listened for a few seconds, said, "Yes. Please hold them in the lobby," and hung up. "Your parents are here," he said. My stomach dropped like an elevator cable snapped. How would they even know I came? I asked, though I already knew the answer. My father could smell control shifting from miles away. Daniel stood and checked the hallway before sitting again, as if he didn't want to be interrupted mid-sentence. "Ms. Chen," he said, voice firm, "do not go into that lobby with this card visible. Do not let anyone photograph it. Do not hand it to anyone just for a second. Your parents will try to turn this into a family matter. It is not. It is a legal matter." As if to underline his point, muffled voices seeped through the door. My mother's voice had that sharp brightness she used when she wanted strangers to think she was the injured party. My father's voice was lower, controlled, the tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while tightening a noose. Then my mother said my name, loud, like a verdict. Daniel slid my ID and the card closer to me and spoke quietly, "They are going to demand that I release you to them, or that I confirm the balance, or that I recognize some authority they claim they have. I will not do any of those things without documentation." I swallowed. "They're going to say I stole it," I said. "Let them," Daniel replied. "We have chain of custody procedures, surveillance, and your identification. Accusations aren't evidence." The door handle rattled once, followed by a knock that wasn't polite. Daniel didn't flinch. He picked up his phone, tapped a button, and said, "Security, please remain positioned in the lobby." Then he looked at me with a seriousness that made my mouth go dry. "If you want control of this process, you need independent legal representation today. Your grandfather's structure requires it, and it protects you. I can give you a list of attorneys who handle trust beneficiaries, and I can arrange a private meeting room with a notary if you choose to proceed." I nodded because my options were either that, or walking back into my parents' hands. Daniel started to dial, then paused as a new voice rose in the hallway, my father's voice, clearer now, saying, "I have power of attorney. She's not competent to handle this. You need to deal with me." Daniel's hand froze over the keypad, and for the first time since I'd entered his office, his face changed in a way that scared me more than the number on the screen. He looked up at me and asked, very carefully, "Ms. Chen, did your grandfather ever sign a power of attorney in favor of your father?" I opened my mouth, and nothing came out, because I didn't know, and my parents had spent my whole life making sure I didn't know the difference between family authority and legal authority. Daniel asked whether my grandfather had ever signed a power of attorney for my father. I didn't know, and that ignorance made me angry, because it meant my parents had kept me uninformed on purpose. Daniel said a valid POA does not automatically control a trust, and my grandfather's trust was written to resist coercion. He pulled up the document log and pointed to an entry. A POA packet had been added to the bank's records the previous month, delivered in person by my father, marked urgent. Grandpa had been weak last month. My father was now outside this door, claiming he had legal control. In the hallway, my mother turned on her public voice and told anyone listening that she was worried about her daughter, that I was confused, and that the bank needed to return a stolen card to the family. Daniel pressed the intercom and told them private client matters would be handled in writing and that security would remove anyone who harassed staff. Then he asked me a question no one in my family had ever asked. If you leave this building alone today, are you safe? I looked down at the black card and answered honestly. No. Daniel called for an internal security escort and an urgent consult with legacy compliance. He slid a short list of trust attorneys across the desk and told me to pick one who did not represent my parents. I called the first number. Maya Patel answered, listened, and then told me not to sign anything and not to speak to my parents without a witness. She asked to speak with Daniel. His tone changed as he took the call, like he was relieved someone serious had entered the room. While they spoke, Daniel's computer pinged with a message from compliance. He printed it and set it in front of me. The trust included an anti-coercion clause. If a non-beneficiary attempted to assert authority, the profile locked, an internal report triggered, and the bank was required to preserve footage and access logs. The second page was a letter of wishes from my grandfather. The first line made my eyes sting. If you are reading this, my son is trying to take what I never meant him to hold. Grandpa wrote that my parents would claim I was unstable, that they would waive paperwork, and that any sudden POA submission should be treated as suspected fraud. He wrote, in plain language, that I was the intended beneficiary and that the bank should document every attempt to pressure employees or redirect assets. Reading it didn't feel like winning money. It felt like being believed in advance. Daniel asked whether I wanted to face my parents. I didn't, but I understood the risk of disappearing. If I vanished, their version of me would harden into fact. I agreed to speak with them only in the glass conference room with security nearby. Daniel escorted me through a side corridor and into the room overlooking the lobby. My parents were at the counter, my father leaning in with controlled anger, my mother gesturing like she was presenting a case. When they saw me, my mother switched instantly to sweetness and called me baby. My father skipped sweetness and demanded the card, saying I wasn't equipped for adult finances. I told them I had independent counsel and that the bank would follow the trust terms. My father's mask slipped and he said he knew exactly what Grandpa had. My mother hissed that Grandpa would be ashamed, then made a mistake that froze the room. We only locked you out because we thought you'd already used it. Daniel's pen stopped. That sentence proved they knew about the card before I ever walked into the branch. At the same moment, Daniel's computer chimed again. An attempted login to my grandfather's trust portal had just come from the lobby Wi-Fi using Grandpa's credentials, and the system had locked down. Daniel met my eyes and said, quietly, your grandfather's trap just closed, and now they're going to panic. In the lobby my father's head snapped toward the ceiling cameras, and for the first time I saw fear on his face too. By the time the lobby Wi-Fi attempt locked the portal, my father's confidence thinned into a tight, angry smile. He stopped performing for the room and started negotiating with his eyes, scanning Daniel, the security guard, the cameras, and me like we were variables he could still control. Maya Patel arrived within 30 minutes, not in a rush but with that calm speed of someone who already knows where the weak joints are. She didn't shake my parents' hands. She didn't raise her voice. She asked Daniel for the document log, the footage timestamps, and a printed record of the failed portal login. Then she asked my father one simple question: when did you last see Lionel Chin sign anything? My father answered too quickly, and my mother tried to rescue him by talking over him, which was exactly what Maya wanted. She turned to Daniel and said, please note that they are claiming capacity and consent on a date when Mr. Chen was hospitalized. The word hospitalized made my father blink hard, because it meant she had already been checked. Maya asked for a private room again, and Daniel moved us away from the lobby like he was relocating a storm. In his office, Maya explained the move my grandfather had designed. The trust didn't just name a beneficiary. It set a test. Anyone who tried to override it had to submit a sworn statement of authority, attach the supporting instrument, and certify under penalty of perjury that no coercion was involved. My father had tried to brute force his way in with a rushed POA drop-off, and now he was trapped in the system he had triggered. Maya told Daniel to keep the account locked and to escalate the suspected fraud to legacy compliance, because the bank had an obligation to preserve everything. Then she looked at me and said, "Here's the revenge part, Layla. We don't fight them with emotion. We let them commit their story in writing." She drafted a short letter to my parents stating that I would participate in beneficiary verification only through counsel, and that any claim of their authority must be submitted formally to the bank for review. It sounded polite. It was a snare. My father demanded to speak to me alone, and Maya said no. My mother tried crying, and Maya handed her tissues without looking at her. Then the real mistake happened. My father pulled out his phone and said he could have our notary email a cleaner copy of the POA within minutes. Maya asked, "Which notary?" He said a name and a business. Daniel typed it into his system, paused, and said that the notary had been flagged 6 months ago for irregular submissions. My father went still. In that silence, I understood what Grandpa had really left me. Not just money, but timing. Maya requested the bank call the notary to verify the email chain, and she requested security preserve the lobby footage of my parents using the Wi-Fi to attempt access. When Daniel complied, my mother snapped that none of this would have happened if I had just been grateful. Maya finally looked at her and said, "Gratitude isn't a legal instrument." Within 24 hours, the bank's fraud unit confirmed what Daniel already suspected. The signature on my father's POA submission didn't match my grandfather's signature exemplars on file, and the notary stamp was tied to a notary who'd already been flagged for irregular submissions. My father's whole strategy had always been to speak with authority until people backed down. That doesn't work on forensic comparisons and audit logs. When the fraud unit escalated the case, it didn't become family drama anymore. It became a suspected forgery investigation, and that meant my father's phone, emails, and timeline were about to be examined by people who don't care how reasonable he sounds. Meanwhile, I completed beneficiary verification with Maya sitting beside me, not as a luxury, but as a requirement my grandfather built into the trust so I could not be cornered alone. The trustee committee approved a modest interim stipend and housing support immediately, because my grandfather had written that if I was forced out, the trust should prevent me from returning out of desperation. I will never forget the relief of signing a lease without begging anyone, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted air. Then came the part my parents didn't see coming. Grandpa had left them a small contingent distribution, not because he loved them, but because he understood incentives. It was conditioned on one simple rule: do not interfere with me, do not attempt to redirect assets, and do not claim authority over my decisions. The compliance officer explained it like a seatbelt. If they tried to yank the wheel, the system locked, and their share evaporated. My parents had already yanked. 2 weeks later, the trustee committee issued a formal determination that interference had occurred, documented by the lobby confrontation, the portal login attempt, and the fraudulent POA submission. Their contingent distribution was revoked permanently. My mother called me from a new number, crying, asking how I could do this to family, and I didn't answer because for the first time in my life I understood that silence can be a boundary instead of a surrender. My father tried a different angle and filed a probate petition claiming I manipulated Grandpa in his final months, but Maya dismantled it with the kind of calm efficiency that feels like magic when you've grown up around intimidation. Hospital records contradicted his dates. The bank's document log showed the POA packet was dropped off when Grandpa was already medically vulnerable. The signature mismatch report made the court look at my father's evidence like it was radioactive. The judge didn't need to call my father a liar. The judge just needed to deny the petition and order no contact, and suddenly my father's voice stopped being law in my life. The forgery investigation took longer, because real systems move slow, but it still landed. The notary was suspended and later charged for unrelated misconduct, and my father was interviewed under caution after his communication records tied him to the document chain he pretended not to know. He didn't go to jail in a dramatic movie way that week, but he lost what mattered to him more than freedom. He lost credibility. He lost access. He lost the ability to walk into a room and be automatically believed. Even relatives who had called me ungrateful went quiet when they realized the only people behaving like thieves were the ones shouting about theft. Months later, I went back to the Willow Branch to thank Daniel, and he looked genuinely relieved to see me upright and calm. He admitted, quietly, that when the system first displayed the balance, he froze because it wasn't just a number, it was a risk event, the kind that attracts predators the moment it's mishandled. Grandpa knew that. Grandpa knew exactly who my parents were. He didn't leave me a fortune to turn me into them. He left it to cut their strings. I didn't buy a mansion or post a victory lap. I set up my life like Grandpa lived his, intentionally. I finished my certifications, hired a security consultant the trustees recommended, put most assets behind professional management, and funded a scholarship program for kids who get thrown out for not fitting the family narrative. The sweetest part of the revenge wasn't the money. It was watching my parents realize they couldn't punish me into obedience anymore, because Grandpa had already paid for my escape in the only language they respected. If you want more stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, because the next chapter is what I found in Grandpa's storage unit after the court filings ended, and why he called me Little Sparrow like he was teaching me how to fly.